15,000 dead. 15,000 wounded. A nuclear bomb detonated in the heart of Washington, D.C. A scenario U.S. intelligence has listed as one of our greatest national security threats.
I think it's important that the American people think the unthinkable. Unless you're willing to stare into the nuclear abyss and confront the magnitude and the significance of what nuclear weapons could do and the challenge of the civilization faces in dealing with that, you can't really appreciate what your government is being asked to do to work this problem.
Government officials have game planned this scenario for over 60 years. The threat of nuclear attack didn't die with the Cold War. It just changed shape.
During the Cold War, if there was an all-out nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, it essentially meant the end of the planet. Terrorists are not going to have a nuclear arsenal of tens of thousands of weapons.
The consequences of nuclear terrorism are far less severe, they're far less dramatic, and they're far less extensive, obviously, than all-out nuclear war would have been.
In short, today's threat is a survivable nuclear war. The plans in place today reflect this reality. The Department of Homeland Security has created detailed attack scenarios and response guidelines.
The impact of a single nuclear weapon on Washington, D.C. is so profound that it has cascading impacts, not just in terms of decision-making that has to be done in the United States, but also on the psychological impact, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world.
The bomb triggers a multi-tiered, well-practiced plan to save America.
What you're seeing is a very rapidly galvanized effort to do two things: try and secure the country from additional attacks, while at the same time trying to deal in an expedient fashion with the human disaster that would exist in and around the explosion itself.
Military leaders outside the Capitol prepare to lock down the nation. Their first order of business, Operation Skatana, shutting down America's airspace. Skatana was originally developed in the 1970s to clear the skies following confirmed warnings of an attack by the Soviet Union. The plan was last launched on 9/11. A call went out from a White House bunker. Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta gave the orders. 90 minutes later, 4,500 commercial planes in American airspace were sitting on tarmacs around the country.
In the event of a catastrophic nuclear strike, you'd see the Transportation Security Administration, which is part of Homeland Security, kind of come into action and to take steps to secure not just the airspace, but also trucking, shipping. Port authorities would come into play. If there were a nuclear detonation, there would be an assumption that it got in somehow through a port of entry or over the border. I think you would see a lot of the Homeland Security agencies, Border Protection, the Coast Guard, taking steps to really sort of seal off the country and go through a lot of that cargo as well. From the government standpoint, if a nuclear device went off in a major city, they would absolutely presume that there were more of them.
How can the president go on TV, if he's still alive, and say, "I'm assuring you that there isn't another bomb"? He won't know that. With one bomb already having gone off, who could be confident that that wasn't true?
Disaster planning rule number 1. Security officials always assume there's a second bomb, and they never underestimate a terrorist.
If you look at the 9/11 Commission report, it says the principal failure of the U.S. government was, quote, a failure of imagination. So what was hard to imagine? That terrorists could hijack airplanes? Excuse me, they had hijacked airplanes before. Now, would the people who sponsored that act, Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, have been happier if 300,000 people had been killed rather than 3,000? If you have any doubt about that, you should go look at the video that Osama bin Laden put out after the event, in which he describes how pleased he is with how successful this venture has been. And if you want to see where they want to go, look at the declaration by al-Qaeda, in which they say their objective is to kill 4 million Americans, including 2 million children. You're not going to get there by hijacking airplanes and crashing them into buildings. So what's the top of that pyramid? It's a mushroom cloud enveloping an American city. If you look at the people who have had responsibility in the U.S. government and had full access to information about what is known about the intent and the activities of al-Qaeda, there's no dispute whatever about the fact that this is where al-Qaeda wants to go.
If there is a nuclear detonation in the city where you are, you really cannot count on emergency personnel getting anywhere near you for an extended amount of time.
First responders with the Washington, D.C. Fire Department are closest to the blast.
Well, some first responders obviously will be some of the casualties.
The D.C. Fire Department has 2,000 members. 8 of the 34 stations are less than 2 miles from ground zero.
The closest ones in, unfortunately, are going to be dead. The next ones will be victims and will be unrecognizable from the lay public in terms of the degree of trauma and burn that they would incur.
The United States doesn't suffer from lack of resources. There are more than 155,000 EMTs, 600,000 police officers, 1.6 million active duty military troops, and 1.1 million reserves and National Guard. Just tapping into 10% of federal resources equals a force the size of the entire population of St. Louis. FEMA coordinates this massive response effort. A component of the Department of Homeland Security, this is post-Katrina FEMA. A FEMA with a plan and a playbook. Less than half a mile from the blast zone, little is left of FEMA headquarters. Their continuity of operations backup plan is an alternate site. Location undisclosed.
We don't do the planning to have meetings. We do the planning to have the plans in place so that not only we have something to go to in a time of crisis, but those who replace us have something to go to in a time of crisis. Whether that's due to the fact that we've retired and moved on, or that we ourselves are casualties of whatever the incident may be.
What we can do from the federal government with regards to public health and medical support is we can bring people. We have close to 10,000 people who are regular full-time emergency room intensive care personnel who are organized into specialized teams that we call disaster medical assistance teams.
The nation's rapid response medical force receives federal travel orders. These civilian volunteers become federalized and are shipped towards the blast zone.
Those folks really are sitting on pins and needles on a day-to-day basis. That is, they know they're up and they may be called. So we were able to get them identified, get them travel, get them their equipment, get them their supplies, and move them downrange within 24 hours.
Many victims in the blast zone won't live that long. The next 60 minutes are critical. Without proper shelter and with radiation thick in the air, 100,000 people will become grim statistics before the end of this program.
This huge cylinder of dust and debris that arises from ground zero, spreads out at the top, fairly high in the sky, becomes the mushroom cloud that we all remember. That is the hallmark of a nuclear detonation. And on the other hand, you might be in a place where there's so much dust and debris that you don't really see much of anything. We'd like people to be aware of what they can do to maximize the chance of them living through this entire catastrophe if they survived the initial blast. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about preparedness for nuclear terrorism in modern society.
There's going to be a period of time where there is no communications with people who are surviving in an impacted area. So one of the key aspects of communication is, what do we tell them before an event?
I don't know how anybody could do this, but I have to give you this advice, is that you don't want to be looking in the direction of the initial flash of light. One can get temporarily blinded and sometimes permanently blinded by staring into a light which would be the equivalent of about 1 million suns. If you can remember to keep your mouth open, it allows the pressure on both sides of your eardrums to be equalized. If your mouth is closed, then all the pressure is going internally and it could burst your eardrums. But then after the blast, you want to try to keep your mouth not only closed, but actually protected if you can, with, if you had a face mask or cloth or anything that might help filter some of the radioactive materials from getting into your lungs.
High doses of radiation kill within hours. Others survive for weeks before their bodies shut down.
The problem with high doses of radiation is that it destroys the cells in the human body. You stop replenishing your blood supply. Your white blood cells, which help protect against infection, and your red blood cells, which carry oxygen, die off and are not replaced. The lining in your intestinal tract, your stomach and your intestines, are very much affected by radiation. People get severe, overwhelming diarrhea and vomiting, and they become dehydrated and sometimes lethally, fatally dehydrated in a relatively short period of time. So the whole idea here is to get out of the hotly radioactive zones and into a safe zone or a shelter as quickly as possible.
But how do you know if your zone is safe?